Welcome everyone to our 16th Food for Thought speaker series session. Today we're honored to have Daniel Nayoks, who is going to be Professor Daniel Nayoks, who's going to be speaking on multilateralism for mobility, cooperation among UN agencies in a post-pandemic world. So I'll hand it off to Bill. Oh, before I hand it off to Bill, if you have questions, please keep them till the end. We will be picking up questions from the chat. You can also raise your hand in the participants tab so that we can call on you to ask the questions directly. And now I'll hand it off to Bill. Thank you, everyone.
So welcome, everyone. We're so happy that what started as something to keep our community together during the height of the pandemic has stretched us all the way toward hopefully a vaccine and a new administration in Washington and a bright future for 2021. And Professor Nayoks is not only a professor, he's a doctor and he's a lawyer, not a medical doctor, but PhD. He is the interim director of International Organization and UN Study Specialization here at SIPA. He teaches here at SIPA. He has been very involved all over the world with the United Nations Development Program, working in South Asia, the US, Europe, South America, North and West Africa, as well as Southeast Asia. His book, Migration, Citizenship, and Development, Diasporic Membership and Policies and Overseas Indians in the United States, was published by Oxford University Press. That's as good as it comes. And he's very active in our community, a great thinker, an activist, and just a very, very nice person. And if you haven't, check out his paper on multilateralism for mobility. It's really, really good. I really enjoyed it. And it's one of the most extensive papers in our series. So we're so grateful to you, Daniel, for joining us today. And I'll turn over the session to you.
Thank you, Bill. Thanks, Valerie. And thanks, Jeremy, for organizing this, and for everybody for joining us. It's really a privilege to be with you and share a few thoughts of mine on multilateralism and mobility. Let me share my screen, because I spent many hours making a very pretty PowerPoint presentation for you. So yeah, and why is this? Wait a second. So, can you all see my slide? Excellent. So today I'm sharing a few thoughts that bring together several of my research agendas. I've been privileged to work hands-on with multilateral cooperation. I've been chairing and leading interagency groups for several years. And now as an academic, I come back and I try to analyze from an analytical and a critical point of view how cooperation works, and especially under the circumstances, the changed circumstances of the COVID-19, post-COVID-19, how that may be in the future. So when people think about the UN, mostly people think about the diplomatic parquet of New York, of Geneva, of states interacting, what we in UN studies call the first UN, states acting. And here I have a little quote from current Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Less than a week ago, he spoke to the Security Council on the global governance of the post-COVID-19.
The pandemic is a clear test of international cooperation, a test we have essentially made.
So, I'm quoting again, he says, the pandemic is a clear test of international cooperation, a test we've essentially failed. But with that, of course, he is mostly referring to how states have collaborated or not to resolve the current pandemic. And we've seen going back to nationalism, closing borders, and other things that we actually do not want. What I want to point you to is that beyond that international cooperation among states, there is the second UN cooperation between UN agencies, which gives a little bit more hope about maybe we haven't failed completely. Second, so, and again, for the UN, most people, apart from the multilateral discussions among states, we often think about the UN as this unitarian actor, right? Most of us working with the UN know that the actual truth about the UN is much more diverse. The UN is a highly fragmented system of different agencies, different programs, different entities. Some are connected, some are independent. And for the longest time, people have thought about how can these different agencies work together. So what I'm going to do in this talk is to unpack what international cooperation between agencies means, and mostly what are structural factors that influence these collaborations. So I've come up with in several ongoing research projects of mine with 5 aspects to look at international cooperation: frequency, mode, levels, issue coverage, and inclusiveness. Frequency just means how often do agencies actually work together. The mode is more interesting and more meaningful. It starts with basic coordination. Coordination means exchange of information so that agencies avoid overlap and duplication of work. Right? It's really the basic most simple way of collaborating. But then there is collaboration and cooperation, two words kind of used synonymously, and they involve more sharing of resources, of energy, of expertise to work together. And on the top of the collaboration or cooperation pyramid is having actually joint integrated programs that have been designed together, that are done together by a multiplicity of agencies. And we've seen those on the rise, though there's still a lack of understanding what prompts them, what makes them successful and what not. And then just a reminder, then these collaborations can work at the global level at headquarters, but also at the regional and national, and in some cases also at the subnational level of in countries. Issue coverage is just a reminder that there's so many different areas of work that the UN works on, right? From economic development over climate change. We have Alex de Sherbanen on the call here, who leads several of Colombia's most important climate change and migration projects, but also security, conflict, agriculture, any area. So we have to understand, is it broadening the scope in which agencies collaborate, or how they're changing? And the last one is inclusiveness. Is it just that the World Health Organization is working with UNHCR on refugee health? Or if you talk about Palestinian refugees, is it UNRWA? Is UNDP joining? Maybe the Human Rights Commissioner, or UNFPA, IFAD works on remittances, the FAO, UNICEF on children, IOM, of course, now a big player on international migration, ILO on labor migration, UNESCO works on migration, UN Women, of course, especially on the gender aspects, and WFP has worked a lot on refugee camps and providing aid in humanitarian situations, right? So the question is, in what scenarios, how many of these actors actually do collaborate? Now let's get a little bit more into cooperation. I just want to give you a very brief timeline about the last 15 years of collaboration, key milestones. So the first is in 2016, we saw first the creation of the Global Migration Group. Then only 6 agencies worked together, came together, they expanded, and until 2018, there were 22 agencies in this Global Migration Group. I was actually there at the founding, and the reason I came to New York first in 2006 was to work on the high-level dialogue on international migration and development. The first time the UN General Assembly actually talked about migration at the GA. The next year, we founded an annual forum on migration and development outside the UN, which since then every year has taken place, to talk about first migration development in the narrow sense, diaspora, remittances, but increasingly all the areas of migration and mobility have been included in these deliberations. We had a second high-level dialogue, and then we launched a global mayoral forum, which again annually has been taking place since then. a very important milestone of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the SDGs, right? I'll talk about that in a second, but we have several explicit mentions of the SDGs, and I have a large research project on seeing how migration and the SDGs interlink, and actually that's a book project I'm working on right now. An important key event happened in 2016, nearly 4 years ago, the New York Summit on refugees, for refugees and migrants, which led to the New York Declaration, which in turn then led to the two processes establishing the two global compacts, one global compact on refugees and one for migration. And also in 2016, the IOM, the International Organization for Migration, which had been an international organization outside of the UN system, became a related agency to the UN. And that had actually implications for how other agencies in the UN system could and would collaborate with the IOM. And then, as I said, the two global compacts for migration and refugees in 2018. And with the two global compacts, the former Global Migration Group was rebranded as UN Network for Migration. And it was not just in renaming, but also it got more resources, it got a clearer focus specifically on the GCM, the Global Compact for Migration, which meant it had a clearer mandate and a stronger secretariat hosted at the IOM. So in the center here are the 5 dimensions that I mentioned earlier on interagency cooperation: frequency, mode, levels, issue coverage, and inclusiveness. And let me just get the video out of the way. So there's several, like you see the 3 time periods: pre-COVID, during COVID, and post-COVID. I'm just going the remainder of the talk stress a few of the factors that influence, and I think will continue to influence cooperation between UN agencies. So first is cooperation in general. Again, not on migration specific. The SDGs have put a lot of stress on integration, on working together across sectors, right? The integration of SDGs that's not climate change and cities and economic empowerment separately, but we ought to think of them in a conjoined fashion. The UN development reform have been underway now for 4 or 5 years. The most recent one, last year became a huge step with the new cooperation frameworks, which may be a little boring for those who are not interested in development cooperation, but for us, that's really interesting how the UN now tries to bring all the UN agencies at the country level together and incentivize really how the UN should work together and how more collaborations and really joint programming, more joint budgeting should be done. The changing the funding environment is, I would say, the key factor that actually influences cooperation on the ground. And we have seen a push towards multi-donor trust funds, towards collaboration on the ground, and donors want to see more collaboration, which is, I think, the most important factor to influence more cooperation among agencies. And then, of course, we have those of you who work in humanitarian affairs, what we call humanitarian development nexus or divide, and the UN established in 2016 at the Istanbul World Humanitarian Summit, the new way of working. Again, it's highly flawed, it's not implemented the way it's supposed to be. Like, all these are lofty ideas, and the ways it is actually implemented is a little bit more challenging. But the ideas about how to create working groups, how to work in the cluster approach, how to actually bring people together is really important. So this is the plus there means all these elements actually enhance or are factors that structurally enhance interagency cooperation. I will very quickly go through the mobility-specific cooperation because most of them were mentioned in the previous slide. SDG focus on migration, and if you're interested in that, I wrote a report, came out 2 years ago for the UN working group on working on the Arab region, which specifies exactly how SDGs are related to mobility. We have several regional refugee migration response plans. The most important, the most well-known is the 3RP, the Regional Refugee and Resilience Plan for the Syrian crises in Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, Iraq, and one more country, Egypt. And these regional plans, for example, the 3RP has 270 partners working in different countries. So that's really important for collaboration between not just UN agencies, but also external partners. And as I mentioned, the global compacts are non-binding, so that from a traditional, simplistic, legalistic way of how they should change things that don't work, but they are really an important point for agencies to rally around and as a focal point to talk to governments, to civil society to get things done. IOM became related agencies, and I mentioned already the UN network. So, just a quick reminder, what I've a large research project, one of my main research projects where I collect all UN development plans. So in each country where the UN works, they have a UN development plan, which used to be called UNDAF, UN Development System Framework. Now it's called Sustainable Development Framework, Cooperation Framework. And I'm the only person in the world who has all 500 of those that exist. So I've done preliminary analysis to see how many of those actually incorporate mobility. And you can see there, the vast majority of these UNDAFs actually include mobility. Refugees, diaspora, remittances, immigration, IDPs. So we see a very large, and they're geared to, and more geared towards cooperating between agencies. And this comes from another research paper that I finished this summer, where I quoted all countries in the MENA region that have an UNDAF, in development UN plan. And I quoted how mobility was integrated in those plans. You can see there, Algeria, Iran don't really integrate that. And Lebanon, Morocco have the highest on 3 dimensions. High intensity, many mentions of mobility. High modality means really having a priority, having measurable outputs for that. And high dimensionality means in many different policy dimensions, not just in health, but also health and education and other areas. In the Q&A, I'd be happy to expand on those. So what we see now during COVID is that first there was a Secretary General's policy brief. Again, that the Secretary General issues a policy brief on people on the move, which includes migrants and displaced people, is per se important. And then in the brief, the SG has mentioned 4 things. First, exclusion is costly in the long run, whereas inclusion of people on the move actually pays off. Second, the response to COVID and protecting the human rights of migrants and refugees are not mutually exclusive. So this false binary or dichotomy between human rights and people on the move and response to the pandemic is not there. The third one, very important, is no one is safe until everyone is safe. And that really has, even in the US, right, where we know if you have undocumented populations and there's a policy stance to say they have to be excluded from schools, they have to be excluded from healthcare. But now we all know if there is a large resident population without access to healthcare, without access to testing abilities, these people still live here. And though they may be legally prohibited from getting infected, I'm being funny here, trying to, they may still get infected, right? And infect your native population. So until everyone is safe, no one is safe. And the last point is people on the move, migrants and refugees, can actually be helped. They can help us to overcome the economic challenges that we are facing right now. They can be providers, they can be nurses, they can be doctors, they can be even the other essential workers that we have seen in food delivery, in the supermarkets, etc. These people can help us. So don't frame it only as a problem, but as an asset to overcome the challenges. And the large global humanitarian response plan, again, it's not on migration, it's a general response plan to COVID, which covers about 6.7 billion, not covers, I mean, it aims at raising that money. Includes 1.5 billion for the regional refugee plans and regional migrant plans. So the very large chunk of that. And it really, and it highlights throughout the response, the importance of understanding the impacts for vulnerable, displaced people, internally displaced, internationally displaced, and migrants. And it aims at establishing a migration health evidence portal. So as I said, we've seen a large mainstreaming of mobility across the response to COVID, and we've seen an increase in joint project integrated programming. The last, of course, is the most problematic or the most difficult, is to see the future. And as you probably know, an expert is defined as somebody who can tell you later why his or her prognosis didn't come true. So maybe I will tell you later why I wasn't right. But here are main factors that I see for the future. There are first a few funding and priorities. Okay, that increase cooperation, right, and reinforcing positive factors. The first is we may see increased mobility needs because of more poverty, fewer jobs in certain regions of the world. These people may have a need to migrate to for their livelihoods. Sometimes we also now see migrants as positive. So this essential worker debate may have put migrants in a better light for some people. We have seen overall, not just on migration, but overall, to some extent, historical forms of multilateral solutions, right? The crises right now, many people try to use that as a window of opportunity to push for stronger multilateral collaborations. And there are opportunities within comprehensive reforms. Again, with the COVID crisis, which is at its core a public health crisis with knock-on effects on the economy and you name it, people have said if we will have comprehensive reforms of healthcare systems, we can include migrants. Because we have seen migrants so prominent in the response to COVID-19, it's quite likely that this will continue. And that is called the caveat here, and it's a big, big caveat. There are many factors, several factors that will decrease the potential of interagency cooperation. The first is global recession and reduced funds may overall reduce the money that international organizations have, right? So that again, overarching the system-wide may reduce cooperation because of fewer activities. We may also have competing priorities because we know already that so many people will be pushed back into extreme poverty. So you could expect that a reorientation of priorities from something that is migration towards core development, core anti-poverty eradication ideas. I mentioned the positive perception of migrants, but on the other hand, some people are now scared of migrants. People think about everybody who's crossing borders as somebody who brings disease. We have seen strong anti-Asian sentiments because of the way some politicians frame the current virus, right? So these elements may actually limit cooperation. And overall, we don't know how much increased nationalism, withdrawal from multilateralism, such as the US withdrawal from the WHO and other factors, will actually prevail, and hence how much we will see a weakening of this. So this was my last slide. I thank you for bearing with me. The key takeaway points that from all this verbiage on the intricacies and theories about migration, mobility, and interagency cooperation is that cooperation for the second UN, meaning all the different UN agencies, is complex, and often it's actually more positive than what we see in the multilateral discussions at the global level. And we still need to understand more what's happening at the country level, how cooperation among agencies at the country level, regional level, and global level may actually enhance what we do at the country level. So again, one of my main pleas for understanding the UN is not only looking at the discussion at the Security Council, at ECOSOC, at the GA, but also it was happening at the other levels of governance. Again, thank you for bearing with me and look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you, Professor Nayak. If you have questions, you can just raise your hand in the participants tab, or you could put them in the chat. Sergey?
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Bill, Jeremy, and Valerie for organizing this event. Thank you, Professor, for this great lecture. I myself work at the UN, so I want to ask you a question about funding. As you rightly pointed out, the UN is now living through a very difficult time, and as far as regular budget is concerned, it's a disaster. As it is, the budget is very small, comparable to, let's say, the Department of Sanitation of New York. And we're supposed to solve the world problems with that little money. But my question is, as you know, there has been a push for specialized agencies that they have their own budgets, for funds and programs rather, to rely more on non-core funding as opposed to funding from the regular budget. And as you know, in this case, some big donors, and these are not just corporations, and even states sometimes refer to fund this or that agency in particular. They have a huge say in these organizations. Do you see a problem here? Because you talked about cooperation and the need for extra cooperation, but these funding problems can really divide the UNHQ and funds and programs. Thank you so much. And just one comment, I really wish our program could kind of attract you for you to do a class in EMPA. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Jeremy, do you want me to answer right away, or do you want to collect?
You can answer right away, if that's all right with you.
Yeah, thanks, Sergey. And obviously, I don't have an easy answer to that. It's you're right. So what Sergey was referring to is that so the UN, the budget of the UN, the funding of the UN is highly fragmented. Like everything in the UN is fragmented, right? If you want to use one word for the UN, I would say fragmented, complex. So we have core funding, which means just like general budget, right? General Assembly, member states say you have that much money. But more and more states say, okay, I give you $10 million to do a 5-year program for this and that. And some agencies rely extremely on project-based and program-based funding. The IOM is the prime example. I could be wrong, but I think it's about 10 or 15% that the IOM's budget is a core budget, and the rest, about 85%, is all in program, which for states can be sometimes very beneficial because, so in the UN debate, and I see several of my students, we had on last Saturday, we had a large event, a large retreat. So Sophia here and Irina here of the UN specialization, and we actually discussed that question there. So they may say, oh, again, that discussion. Where on the one hand, states want to have a say, like we say accountability. And the same as development actors sometimes say, development donors say, okay, there's corruption, there's inefficiencies. We want to make sure we're just giving random money and nothing happens with the money. We want to have accountability. We want to actually tell you what to do with the money. On the other hand is ownership, right? We say to give agencies and those who give money ownership to do things. The real problem, of course, with the program-based funding is that it makes UN agencies much less critical of their key donors, because and much less agile to react. Because if funding is earmarked, you can only spend the money on that. If there's a major crisis and you say, I would like to appropriate some of the money for something else, you can't unless you get approval from the donor, which is such a long process, nobody even endeavors to do that. So I think everybody says that it's better to give full budget support, right? Increase the general budget, go away from earmarked small project funding. And I've been an advisor to UNDP for the last 6-7 years, and UNDP has tried in the board to push more towards core funding and less away from these pet projects and small projects, which kind of makes it hard. Also, if you think about a vision, like if we at CEPA, we think about the best organizational structure of an organization. We come up with the planning cycle and having coherence, having an overarching framework and how these things work together. But of course, if you have a strategic plan, but you have all these things that are earmarked, you can come up with one big umbrella, but it's harder. If you actually have big money, like money on the top, you can come up with a strategic idea how to devise development best, how come up with priorities that are based on the necessities from the needs on the ground. So I think most of us are advocating for more core funding, etc. But I think because states say, oh, I want to make my mark on South-South cooperation, on water management, on another topic, and they fund these specific programs, right? So it's definitely a dilemma. But what I see is that there is a certain push towards more multi-donor trust funds. Again, not the way we want to see it, but I think this is one way of actually, I mean, again, it's not core budget, but it's still a more generalized way where then the trust fund determines how to allocate the money, not the donor. So these are my reflections, but it's definitely one of the key things. Funding always sounds a little boring because we want to talk about sustainable development and gender equality, etc. But the key factor, the one key factor that determines what we can do is the resources we have. So thanks for the question, Sergey.
Thank you so much for the answer.
Right. If you have a question, I have a question. If we don't have any others, I don't want to get in front of anyone. But so actually, I wanted to follow up on that question about that funding because I think it's a very interesting point. When did this trend begin? Was it from the beginning there was involvement from states in that fashion, funding programs? Or was there a point where that shifted to, becoming 85% of the budget for some programs? And I guess the second point would be, when you're talking about donors, does that mean states, or those organizations, are those businesses, or are they individuals, or are they all? None?
Thanks, Jeremy. And I must admit, when I don't know, I don't have a good answer. So I don't know. I can't tell you about the historic development. I don't have a scheme about the last 20 years how the UN funding shifted. I wish I had, and some people focus on that. It's not the key focus of my own research, which is why I can't give you that in perspective. But some like IOM always had a stronger focus. They always had a smaller mandate, but it's also given the history how the IOM actually became what it was, and some states of course preferred having that. Some agencies like UNDP, right, it's a program under the UN, so it gets funds from the UN. And as Sergey mentioned, we have specialized agencies such as the ILO, which are independent. They have their own governing council, they have their own budgets, UNESCO, and all these are standalone agencies with their own systems, governing systems. But the majority of UN agencies have had mostly core funding, and then have some amount of program base or earmarked or PET funding. I can't tell you exactly right now that, again, I don't have a comparison of all the agencies across time. But sorry, the second part of the question was, I could answer more, but I forgot what it was.
Just who the donors are.
Oh, yeah. No, and until now, the vast majority of funds are from states. So the UN gets some money from foundations here and there, but overall it's all states who pay contributions or pay projects. They have been more, the last like 5 years especially, the UN has made a push to work with the private sector and have some of those, like UNDP has several endeavors to work with private sectors, also to use more funding in PPP, private-public partnerships. But again, I don't have the actual numbers right now, but I would say, like, again, I would say 96% of the funding is probably from states, but don't quote me on that number. Another faculty in our program, Professor Bruce Jenks, he actually works a lot on the financing, so he could be probably tell you this much more in detail.
Thank you. Have any other questions from the chat? Jennifer has a question.
I can ask it. So I was thinking back to your that 3D chart that you had, and you had mentioned about the different countries that weren't mentioning mobility, and so you can kind of tell that they weren't focused on it. And so what happens, you know, so once you indicate that the countries, I think it was Armenia and
Algeria.
And oh, I'm sorry.
Algeria.
Oh, I'm sorry. Algeria and Iran on the bottom. So what happens next?
What do you mean what happens next?
Okay. So once you've indicated that they don't have the mobility plans, how does the UN then get involved to help them to focus on this?
That's a good question. And actually, I wrote an entire research paper this summer on exploring in these 12 countries why the UN, first how, and then trying to explain why the UN development plans have a strong emphasis on this. And let me pull up my slide again. So everybody sees what you are talking about. And I very much appreciate you calling it a cool 3D graph, because I think it's very cool. So by the way, for the different colors mean how the depth of it, right? So the blue ones are in the back, the orange ones are slightly more, then the orange, the gray ones come in the front, and the very first is Algeria and Iran. So for Iran, for example, the Iranian government, Iran actually has a lot of refugees, mostly from Afghanistan. Iran and Pakistan are have the oldest refugee situations in the world. More than 40 years have these Afghan refugees been there, of now second, third generation. But Iran views migration and mobility, everything connected to it, as a national security issue. Be it because of those Afghan refugees, be it because of the regime's connections to exilees. Some of them are not very much in favor of the government. So everything that is related to migration, Iranian government did not want to have in there. So they said, UN, you cannot work on migration issues. And only now, so the UNDAF is now 3 years old. And last year, there was a midterm review, and their IOM was actually able to get into this document for the first time, really. Which is actually a reminder, which most people forget, that the UN can only work in a country with the explicit consent of the government. We actually, at the retreat that we had for the UN Studies Specialization on Saturday, our guest speaker was the Secretary General's NYU on Youth. And she, and some people told her, why can't you do more? Why can't you have a helpline? Why can't you provide these youth with more help? And what she said, and which is was rang very true to everybody of us who works on UN issues, is the UN is not an NGO, right? The UN is at the country level very much at the mercy of the national government, whoever the official national government is. And when they say, whoever they are, UN, you can only work on these issues, they can only work on those issues. Like there's few, of course, there's the Human Rights Committee, there's the Security Council, there's some exceptions where the UN can overstep and can sometimes do something against the government. But overall, especially programming at the country level, they can only do it with the government, which means the government has to have a certain either openness or interest to work with the UN on issues. So Lebanon, for example, is on the top there because, I mean, Lebanon has the highest proportion of refugees compared to their population in the world. About, depending on how you count, between 20 and 30% of the population of Lebanon are refugees. And so the healthcare system, the education system, every employment, the labor market are so affected by this incoming by these refugees that Lebanon needs a lot of support, right, from the international community. Morocco, on the other hand, doesn't have many refugees. It has some sub-Saharan refugee migrants, mostly from Senegal and other French-speaking countries. But it is one of the key leaders, international leaders, to actually push for migration reform in the Global South, mostly at an as a discursive tool more than an actual tool. But yeah, so you can see that that's why it's a broad range about how different countries think about themselves as immigration, as emigration, as refugee hosting, as origin of refugee countries, and how the UN can actually put this on the agenda or not. So yeah, sorry if I was a little lengthy in my answer.
Thank you.
Anybody else wants to comment? Again, don't feel free to, don't ask questions, only if you have comments. Feel free to say, that was BS, Professor, I don't believe that, you know, like feel free to test my ability.
Anne?
Hi. Thanks for your presentation. It was awesome. Sorry I missed part of it. So if my question has already been answered, feel free to ignore it. But I was going through and maybe just trying to understand, and I would just ask this as a direct question without like providing any context. I'm curious to know how the UN plans on leveraging regional organizations such as like the African Union or ECOWAS to incorporate like this mobility you talk about. And if you've mentioned this already, like I said, apologies, I jumped in a bit late. And I think I'm just wondering generally to what extent they can actually influence these regional type organizations.
Thanks, Anne. And that's a very good question that has not been answered yet. I try to, because I already had a broad scope of what I try to focus on, so I focus more on intra-UN, like between UN agencies, cooperation. But you're right, regional organizations are very important partners, and we can see also, again, one thing that I mentioned in the dimensions of cooperation is the level, global, regional, national, subnational. So the region level becomes much more important. Many UN agencies actually shifting emphasis of their own structures and programming from the headquarters, which are mostly in the global north, but of course Nairobi and Addis have also important headquarters, to the regional level, right? The regional level becomes often a very important platform and venue for discussing things, and it can be either African Union or, as you said, ECOWAS or the Andean community or ASEAN or many of these other regional organizations. But of course, ECOWAS is particularly strong, well organized, right? The African Union with NEPAD, the development organization, is a very strong partner of many UN agencies. So because UN is now working more at the regional level, they also do have more cooperations with these regional intergovernmental organizations. And I agree that we need to actually focus more on that. And we at the UN Studies Specialization actually had planned to organize a few things with regional organizations. Actually, I was talking to the AU here, the representative. She hopefully comes in for a talk to say how cooperation with other agencies works.
Thank you, Anne.
Let me just plug in my computer. My power will otherwise go away. Wait a second. Yeah, but feel free to ask in the meantime. And safe.
Any question, comments? Take advantage. We have an expert with us today. Oh, we have a question in the chat from Sergey. Following the reform in the country presence, the resident coordinator system, have there been any improvements in the agency's cooperation on the ground?
Thanks, Sergey. And again, a very good question. And I can also share with you, we had actually a high-level panel discussion that I moderated in the spring with several high-level experts on UN development reform, in which we actually focused also on the the RC system. RC, in every country where the UN works more than 5 agencies, there is a so-called UN country team, or in the UN we always use acronyms, we call it UNCT, UN country team. And the UN country team is headed by the RC, the resident coordinator, which until mid last year was normally the head of UNDP, the UN Development Program. And one part of the reform of the development system was to detach UNDP and the RC. Now the resident coordinator is directly responsible to the Secretary General, not really, in theory to the Associate Secretary General, but also not really, but in theory that's the pathway. And they have their own offices. It's still new because only in July last, or like no, sorry, in January last year it actually started. And we really have to see how this pans out. There have been some, and again, it's not just the RC system, it's in collaboration with the new Sustainable Development and Cooperation Framework, or just Cooperation Framework, the revamp of the UNDAF that I mentioned earlier in my talk, which is in theory a very good instrument. If you want to read, I would be happy to share also the a short brief on the development system, on this new instrument. And in theory, it's very good how to increase more cooperation. The question always is how to get beyond the keywords that these nice documents use to actually more collaboration. And a framework, whatever framework you put in a writing, is not sufficient to actually do that. Same with the RC system. There have been some instances where and I talked to several RCs, and they work with DCO, or the Development Cooperation Office, which is like the office in the Associate SD's office that coordinates all the resident coordinators in the world. And there are some instances where this independence of the RC, when she or he is now speaking with the government, she doesn't have to say, okay, now I'm UNDP and now I'm putting my RC hat on. I put my UNDP, but now it's clear this person is the resident coordinator speaking only on behalf of the UN system, is helpful in discussions. And again, with a little bit more weight than just being additional in RC. But there are still many issues, and I didn't get into the intricacies, but the funny thing is, as always, at least that's my experience, from broad, big ideas, getting down to actual change, it's the minutiae, it's the small details that make a difference. So for example, differences in reporting mechanisms to different donors, different financing and budget mechanisms, different overheads. Sometimes I led a global immersion course to Istanbul. So SIPA, as you may know, we came up with a new course format in January this year, where I took 20 students to go to Istanbul. We spent 10 days there in Istanbul and Antep to talk to refugee agencies and UN agencies about Syrian refugees in Turkey, including the resident coordinator. So what they said, IOM, which now does a lot of work on migration, they wanted to collaborate with other agencies for a large EU grant, but because IOM has a different overhead, which was barred by the guidelines by the EU, they couldn't do a joint project. So these really sometimes minor things about management of people, of resources, can really put a dent into how people cooperate. That's, I think, in the long run, people will find mechanisms that they change those, but if you're from outside the administration, you get always frustrated how slow things move. Think like, why can't they just do it? But one thing, if you work with any bureaucracy, you know that things take time. And I don't want to say, yes, it's correct, but it's just a matter of fact that they take time, and these agencies need time to adjust their processes. There's a lot of things that just take time. So that's why I hope to see an actual change in a year or 2 years. It doesn't normally happen instantaneously.
Will you be doing any other trips like that?
So this was, I mean, bring it back to post-pandemic world, right? So I mean, in the post-pandemic world, yes. In the pandemic world, of course, we had to cancel the trip. And SEPA was going to offer 3-4 of those trips with a new course format, mostly for our MIA students. Was really one of the signature things that SEPA was supposed to do. It was really amazing. I love the trip. I believe students liked it too. So I was supposed to go in January. We all had different other projects in the pipeline, but because of the travel restrictions and the uncertainty and all the other things, for now it's appended, and let's see what we do in the future. Actually, tomorrow I have a call with our Hazel May, our associate dean, to discuss how to do this in the future. But yeah, for now, as you may imagine, traveling together with 20 people internationally is not the best thing that SEPA is envisioning. But yeah, if there's something, I'm happy to have you on board.
I think we have another question in the chat from Sophia. My question is, how do you see the technology can help the UN be more transparent, or do you have any other suggestions?
Thanks, Sophia. So technology can play an important role. I myself, I'm always skeptical of just saying, oh, technology can do it, right? I mean, that's often like, if you go to the private sector, and I know some of you have private sector experience, wink, wink, think, oh, technology, like every time you get in a consultancy firm, it's like, oh yeah, use the technology. Like, yeah, it can help, but many processes, collaboration, these are personal processes where you need to have platforms, institutions, but you think work with people. Technology can play a role, especially when it gets, like, you remember the 3 levels of collaboration that I mentioned, the modes, intensity: coordination, collaboration, joint programming. The first is in terms of collaboration. Coordination, where we now see some platforms have come up where UN country teams, different agencies within the UN country teams share what they're doing in a much more accessible way. If they do a survey, if they collect data, if they do a project, they can upload it to a certain database, which can be searched by keywords, where you can filter. So these things make it sometimes easier to see who else is acting in, and because if you have 300 projects in a country, right, there's very few people who understand what's going on. There may be a lot of overlap. So technology, especially for these things, can really be helpful. And then, of course, technology can be a huge play a role in designing programs. So right now, the UN is really trying to understand, like the CCA, the Common Country Analysis, is the analytical first step for all these development plans. The idea is, and it has been for the last 30 years, we first do an analysis of all the realities in the country, and then based on that data, we will do the formulation of our priorities, programs, etc. In theory, from a programming cycle perspective, it's like a no-brainer, right? You first get the data, then you engage in some kind of programming, and then you do the implementation, monitoring, evaluation, right? Like very classic cycle. The problem, of course, is how to get good data, and that is actually a challenge that nobody has solved as of now. And technology can definitely help the UN and other actors to get instant data. So we were talking more about big data. I'm also not sure. I've worked a little bit on big data. I'm not an analyst, but I'm looked into this, especially for migration and mobility. Yeah, you can do a few things with this, interesting, but it comes with a lot of challenges too. You can sometimes do, like, the cell phone monitoring can be a huge tool that actually helps people to understand movements of people, which then can be important for service delivery. But also online surveys or surveys based on cell phone data can be very important. UNICEF and also UNDP have really, especially in Uganda and East Africa, have really piloted a few of these innovative data systems. And I think the UN can definitely use them, not for the coordination per se, but for getting the important information that they can then base the joint programming on.
Thank you, Sophia. So we're winding down. If we have any other questions, now's your chance. I have a question, if I may.
Right.
This is about, this links to what we're talking about, collaboration, coordination, but also the RC point that you brought up earlier. And what I was interested in is the relationship between the different agencies and when they're acting in a certain space. So in the technology question, you answered that, you know, it helps agencies determine where other actors are working in certain spaces. So, and in your framework, you talk about collaboration, coordination, those things. Have you seen in your experience kind of tension between agencies over certain turfs, and how is that mediated, and how does that fit into your framework for migration?
Very much so. I didn't have much time to talk about this, but because I was talking about structural factors that would influence the future as I see it, there is a lot of competition between agencies. And what people don't realize, there is sometimes competition and quarreling between different actors within one agency, different bureaus, different departments. The regional versus the country versus the headquarters level can sometimes in the same agency be at quarrels. And sometimes this is mandate related. Sometimes it's actually just funding related, right? There's a lot of overlap which can't be avoided. As one of our speakers, we had in the event that I mentioned earlier on the development reform, the assistant administrator of UNDP, which is like the second command, like the head of UNDP is called the administrator, little not very ceremoniously. And Murad Waba from Egypt, he said nobody would invent the UN system as it is right now if we had to invent it from scratch. Right? It's the way it came about is because of historical developments, just like it happened. But if we all had to reinvent it from scratch, we wouldn't do it the same way. And that's somebody who like believes in the UN system. Like I believe in the UN system, but still there's the WHO work on health has of course an overlap when it comes to children's health with UNICEF, or with refugee health with UNHCR. The IOM working on migration has an overlap with UNHCR, and there are different definitions. IOM uses the official statistical definition of a migrant, who is anybody who moves borders, regardless whether they're actually an economic migrant or a refugee. UNHCR would say a migrant is only an economic migrant to distinguish them from the refugees, which are their core group. The ILO works on labor migrants, and it has been a long history of the ILO of working. So there have been a lot of turf wars about these issues among agencies, again, because it's also about who shapes things, who gets money. Often it's about funding, but it's also about key ideas. Sometimes people say, oh, we are more human rights centered and the other people are more the long hand of other states. And there are sometimes real clashes in terms of ideology, which is definitely there. And the question is how to, there's no real mechanism to mitigate that, right? In theory, of course, there are protocols and there's ways how to collaborate, but in practice, there's not a mitigator who like brings people together. It depends a lot on persons. So that's one thing that people often misunderstand is institutions without people don't exist, right? So we can look at institutions per se, and there is something that institutional culture that gets to people, but in the end, people still matter. If the two heads of agencies work well together and they click, they actually may do things together. Sometimes at the working level, I've been chairing several working groups on migration for the Global Migration Group, and even with a lot of animosity among agencies at the headquarters level, at the working level, often people liked each other. We all had a common concern for migration, so there people came up with joint programs still, right? And one thing is that we shouldn't forget the very personal dimension. If I am a program manager, let's say at UNHCR, the IOM, and I get a Swiss grant of 10 million, that's good for me, right? So I get promoted because I'm getting that grant. So there are these, now nothing to do with institutions, just with how I, as a program head or director, whatever, want to advance in my career, or just have more people, or whatever I feel I should be doing to advance in my career, right? So some of these factors, which have nothing to do with mandates, whatever, can steer where money and where projects are going. And again, when donors focus on, no, we want a joint project, we give it to, then there is less incentive for that. So I think that's why I highlighted the overarching funding structure as one of the key determinants for the future of interagency cooperation.
Thank you. All right, well, I wanted to thank you for joining us. And if you want to say something before we go, I want to give you that time to.
No, I thank you. And always great to be with EMPA students. And I know many of you guys come to my office hours and our events. Many of you are really always there. So I know that there is a lot of expertise, and the questions you have really shown that I couldn't answer them, which means that they had a lot of substance to them. Now, I very much enjoyed having an opportunity to engage with you guys and to hear your questions and comments. And I have no doubt that we'll cross paths in different events in the future. And just a little plug, if you're not yet on the SIPA IOUNS campus group, please join us. We have a weekly newsletter. Today's you've just missed if you're not on that, where we have events, where we have internships on the UN, and we're also on Twitter on UN at Columbia. So if you're quite an active account, so if feel free to help us spread the word about multilateralism.
Thank you so much for an amazing presentation.
Can you repeat that name of the, which one? Sorry, can you repeat the name of that again?
The Twitter. UN at Columbia. So the Twitter, UN at Columbia. And the other one is a campus group. Just if you put in campus groups, I assume everybody is familiar with campus groups. IOUNS, right? That's the specialization that I direct. And we have this weekly newsletter and other event information about international organizations. Thanks, Sophia.
Alrighty, thank you so much. And we hope to see you back here, hopefully in the future, for another Food for Thought. And I want to thank everyone for joining us, and we'll catch you next time around. So have a good day, everyone.